In this lesson, we're working on mixed numbers and improper fractions, and in particular, we are going to convert back and forth between the two. Our objectives are to take an improper fraction and to write it in its mixed number format, and to go backwards, take a mixed number and write it as an improper fraction, just converting between the two. Now, there are a couple of prerequisite skills that you have to have. You will need to be able to do long division until you get a remainder. You'll also have to be able to multiply and add whole numbers. And of course, anytime you work with fractions, you'll have to work on simplifying. All right, start off, piece of vocabulary. The one here on the left is a proper fraction. It's considered a proper fraction because the top number, our numerator, is smaller than the denominator. The one on the right has 5 in the numerator, 2 in the denominator. Well, because 5 is bigger than 2, that's what makes it an improper fraction. Depending on the context of the problem, sometimes improper fractions are okay, sometimes they're not. It just depends on the specific problem. By and large, we are going to work with the assumption that we want mixed numbers instead of improper fractions. All right, first things first. Here's a mixed number. A mixed number is called mixed because it has two different pieces. We've got a mixture of regular whole numbers mixed with fractions. Whenever you have a mixed number, it has to be a proper fraction. It is not okay to ever leave a mixed number in a form like here. 7 4/3 looks like it's a mixed number, but because it's an improper fraction, that's not something that we are willing to accept. This, by the way, will play a role when we work on adding and subtracting mixed numbers in a future lesson. As I was noticing, depending on the problem and depending on what you want to do, sometimes it's easier to work with a mixed number, 7 2/5. Sometimes it's easier to work with it as an improper fraction, 37/5. Our main objective of this lesson is that we can convert back and forth between the two different ways of writing this number. That way we can always pick the method that will be easier. We don't want to have to work with hard numbers if we can avoid it. So, here's one of our two objectives. Take this improper fraction and write it as a mixed number. In order to do this, you have to remember one thing. Fractions are division. 7/3 is saying 7 divided by 3. So you would need to set this up, 7 divided by 3, and run through the long division until you get a remainder. How many times will 3 fit inside 7? Goes twice. So when we take 2 times 3 and get 6, we get a remainder of 1. This piece right here tells us everything that we need to get our answer. That part is the whole number. 2. The remainder is your numerator, the top number. And the number that you originally divided by, that's the denominator. There's our answer, 2 1/3. And it's based simply on dividing. All right, what about here? 8/4. 8 divided by 4 goes in twice. And we've got no remainder. Anytime you've got a remainder of 0, you never bother writing the fraction. You'll just leave it as 2. Now, before we get into these type, I would like to show you a piece that could be a bit of a time save. A lot of times students will look at these things and say, I don't like doing the long division. Well, if you're allowed to use a calculator, and I want to emphasize this, if you're allowed to use a calculator, there are some tools that you can use that will do this process on the calculator, but you have to know how to do it. All right, so here's my calculator. If I wanted to turn the improper fractions, basically we're looking at it and saying, how do we get this number of 2 1/3 using the calculator without having to do the long division ourselves? Well, you still need to remember it is division regardless. You can't get around it. You have to know that fractions are division. And so we'll simply start off 7 divided by 3. That will give you your answer written in its decimal format, not the fraction mixed number format that we want. So of course our task then becomes, how do you change it from this decimal format into the fraction? Well, a lot of times you can remember what the decimal form is. A lot of people will remember 0.3333333, that repeating 3. A lot of times they just remember that it's 1/3. If you don't remember that though, you could actually go through and subtract off the whole number of 2. When you look in front of our decimal, how we've got 2 point, if we subtract off that 2, which is simply going through and saying that's our whole number, the number you subtract off in front of the decimal is the whole number. And then what we would have to do is take the denominator we divided by. Earlier, we divided by this denominator of 3. If we multiply by that 3, this is going to give us our numerator. And there we've got our answer. This same skill we'll be able to apply with other problems. For instance, and here I'm just making up an improper fraction. What is 37/6 written as a mixed number? Well, of course, we could set that up and write out the long division. That's absolutely valid technique. But if you want to use this calculator method, if you're using the calculator, it's just 37 divided by 6, which gives you your answer as a decimal. What's the whole number part here? That's the same thing as saying what number is in front of the decimal. Okay, since that's 6, we will subtract off that 6 and get the decimal part. To get our numerator, we then have to multiply by that thing that we divided by, our original denominator. In this instance, it was 6 a second time. So multiply by 6, that's your numerator. And we're done. Ultimately, you would have some options available to you. If you are allowed to use a calculator, you can use this technique. If you're working on something where you're not allowed to use a calculator, you'll have to know how to do the long division. It just depends on what you're allowed to do. Now, of course, we also want to have our objectives fulfilled of converting backwards. If we have an improper a mixed number, turn this mixed number into an improper fraction. 2 quick pieces. You noted when we did this one before with the calculator, the first thing we did was subtract. The second thing we did was multiply, was to multiply, or that dividing. Well, same technique here. We will start with multiplication as our first step, then take that number and add for the second step. What's 4 multiplied by 2? That's 8. 8 added to 1, that's 9. That's your numerator. The denominator stays the same. Done. Just 2 pieces. Quick multiply, then add. And of course, if you're allowed to use a calculator, then you can speed it up even more by simply taking your calculator and hitting 5 times 3. That, of course, is 15. 15 plus 3. 15 plus 3 is 18, so this is 18/5. And we're done. Of course, if you're working with simple numbers like 5 times 3, we'd expect that you can do 5 times 3 without a calculator. We'd expect that you can do 18 plus 3 without a calculator. But if you're doing bigger numbers, for instance, 24 and 11/15, calculator might be helpful here just as a time saver. You could still go off to the side and take 24 times 18 and get 360. 360 plus 11 would give you 371, so it's still possible to do it. However, if you're going to use the calculator, 15 times 24, 360, plus 11, and we could still get this piece with our tool to help us out, 371 over 15. Done. Last example for this video. During 1 month, you use 13 half hours. So that's saying 13 of a half an hour, 13 halves. How many total hours does that? So all we're doing is converting this into a mixed number. What's 13 divided by 2? 2 will fit in 6 times, giving us a remainder of 1. So 6, remainder of 1. We're done. Use 6.5 hours of phone time. And we'll note each one of these then were examples addressing our objectives. Start with an improper fraction, end with a mixed number. Or start with a mixed number, end with an improper fraction, converting back and forth between the two.